Today we'll be talking about brain basics. How do we study the brain and what's there to study? So we're going to start off with talking about the different machines that we use to study the brain. The first one is the EEG machine. All right, this is very non-invasive. What you do, you strap electrodes to detect impulses. All right, so we just talked about neurons, and when they fire, that's called action potential. And so that's what the EEG machine does. It's just tracking all these impulses that you're having. For each of the machines we talk about, you need to know kind of like the key thing it's used for. So the main thing you know for the EEG machine is that it's often used in sleep studies. That's extremely important, right? Often used in sleep studies. When you use an EEG machine, you get your results look kind of like a polygraph. So you see these things right here. This is the results of an EEG machine. All right, so it's not invasive. If you see the woman here, she has electrodes strapped to her head, and it's just measuring your brain waves. Like I said, the key thing for the EEG machine, make sure you know that this is what we use in sleep studies usually. The CAT scan or the CT scan. Some of you guys might have even had this before. All right, so what this is you use a two-dimensional X-ray machine to get a cross-sectional picture. All right, so you kind of go into this donut-shaped machine that takes many pictures at once. The key thing, at least when we reference brain with these machines, is we use it to detect brain damage. All right, so that's an important thing to know for the CAT scan. And obviously, we're going to talk about the CAT scan, MRIs, different things like that. We're pretty much referencing what it does with the brain. So obviously, you can get a CAT scan and MRIs for a lot of you guys have got them on your knees and different things like that. I'm just focusing on how we use it with the brain. All right, so EEG machine we use in sleep studies. CAT scans we use to detect brain damage. PET scan is used to observe blood flow or metabolism. So what happens with the PET scan is a person gets injected with radioactive sugar molecules to highlight blood flow. All right, so that's key. All right, so for this one, we're measuring blood flow, and that's where the colored part comes in. All right, so we're looking at what part of your brain is more active or not. So this colored, so this is results of a PET scan. The colored areas tell you what parts of the brain are getting heavy, have heavy activity versus very little activity. So what might happen is maybe you're doing a math problem and all of a sudden you start seeing like a left side of the brain start to light up. And so we know, that's the logical part of your brain. Or you're reading and a different part of your brain lights up. Right? So we can kind of see where the flow's going. And so we found out in like serial killers, they have very little activity in their frontal lobes. That's because we're going to learn that's where like your judgment comes from, your planning, your personality, things like that. So they have very little, morality telling them, what to do, like violent criminals and stuff like that. So you would see very little activity in the frontal lobes of violent people and serial killers. The last bullet point says pets like sugar. Right. This is my mnemonic device on how I remember what the PET scans are for. Because I always remember you have to take a radioactive sugar molecule, and then that's how they measure the blood flow. So that's how they can see the blood flowing in your brain. So that's just one way I remember it. If you can create your own, right, you're going to be more likely to remember it. So that's something I always advise is create your own mnemonic devices as you go along throughout the year for this class and really for any class. All right, so MRIs use magnetic fields by sending radio pulses while a person is sent through a tube on a bed. So the key thing for MRIs is it's the best tool to get a detailed map of the brain. I mean, so if you look at this MRI here, I mean, I can see everything in the brain. I got the cerebellum here. This is the brainstem we're about to talk about with the pons right here. You got the cerebral cortex, the foldy things on the outside. You can see the limbic system on the inside, the corpus callosum, that splits it. So you can see a very detailed, picture of the brain. So that's the key thing for MRI. There is also, your book talks about an fMRI, which is just a functional MRI, which is they take an MRI while you're actually doing something. All right, so maybe you're reading or doing a math problem, whatever it might be, and they take an MRI while you do that. So early brain mapping. One of the early sciences, if you want to call it, to brain mapping is called phrenology. So what this was is by studying the lumps on a person's skull, early scientists thought they could map out the brain. So they literally just fill the lumps on your skull, almost like a scalp massage, and they thought they could, kind of tell the different parts of the brain. Now this was not accurate at all, but the idea of localization of brain functions was key, right? They're kind of the first ones that said, hey, this part of the brain, does this. This part of the brain does that. Over here is how you see. Over here is, your hearing. Over here is your math, your reading, your art, different things like that. That's key because, different parts of our brain do have different functions. Now, trying to figure out by filling the lumps on your head wasn't the proper way to go about it, but the idea was there, and that's very important to know. And if you can you can look at the brain here and see the different things. You got morality up here. The thing that I always think is funny is they have language underneath the eye, which is not part of your brain at all. All right, so let's start talking about the brain a little bit, and then I'll post in the playlist what a real brain looks like, a dissection of a real brain. So the brain evolution, right? So brains have evolved throughout time, right? The human species, we're the most advanced animal on the planet, right? So we have the most evolved brain. Well, not all animals have a brain evolved like we do. So even the most primitive animals, most of them all have a brain stem, right? All have a brain stem. So that's the green part of this picture over here. This is the brain stem, which is made up of like the spine, which feeds into the medulla and the pons. Then comes the cerebellum. That's the yellow thing right here. This is also known as the second brain or the little brain. And I'll go into more details about each of these parts as the notes go on. And then comes the limbic system, right? That's the pinkish color one, right? So this is the higher functioning animals have this, like the amygdala, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus. All right, so this is how the brain has evolved. So pretty much if you think about it, it kind of evolves from the middle, like the down, like this area, out, right? So in if you have a question like this on your test, it might not say brainstem, cerebellum, limbic system. I might give you one part of the limbic system. It might have hypothalamus there. It might have medulla, and so you have to know the different parts as well. And then on the outside of your brain, that's the cerebral cortex we'll talk about last. That would be the highest order thinking because that's your most critical thinking. So if you think about brain evolution, think about the basic, like inside a brain. As you work your way out, that is how the brain has kind of evolved. And the further out you get, the more complicated the brain function becomes. The hindbrain. All right, so the hindbrain includes the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So that's the blue area in the parts of the brain. So medulla, a lot of you guys heard medulla oblongata before. It's always a fun word to say. If you've ever seen Waterboy, they talk about that in Waterboy, medulla oblongata, and how you use it. Unfortunately, how they use it in the movie is not how humans use it, because they talk about how, you know, the professor asks why do crocodile, why are they so ornery? And the water boy says, well, my mama said that they have all those teeth and no toothbrush. Well, obviously that wasn't right, and then he tackles the professor because the professor laughs at him. If you haven't seen Waterboy, highly recommend it. But with alligators or crocodiles, they are a primitive species. They've been around for hundreds of millions of years. So, their medulla oblongata has a different function from ours. So ours, in this whole region, pretty much collectively support, our vital bodily processes. So this is just a region, the hindbrain, and I'll go over the specific parts of the hindbrain now. So the brain stem, the first part is just made up of the medulla and the pons. The reticular formation we'll talk about also. This is just nerve fibers that go through the brain stem, and then you got the thalamus on top. All right, so first we'll talk about the medulla. Depending on how you're taking notes, I do have some handouts that look like this brain, and you'll have different boxes, like here. In this box, if you're filling this out, the medulla is the bottom box on the one picture. And we'll talk about how to do notes later. or we've already talked about it. So some of the key functions of the medulla, right? Breathing, heart rate, digestion, and other vital reflexes. So like those could be swallowing, coughing, vomiting, sneezing. So a lot of people don't realize, oh, those are vital reflexes. Yeah, think about you have to swallow, to survive, to eat food. Vomiting, coughing, sneezing. That's because you have something, like if you're coughing, maybe you have something stuck in your throat. So if you have to cough to get it out. A lot of us would have choked if we didn't have that reflex. Or even vomiting means you have something bad in your stomach, maybe poisonous, and you need to get rid of it. Right? So the medulla, these are your basic vital life functions. If your medulla stopped working, if you had damage to your medulla, you would not be able to survive. Right? Obviously, you need to breathe. You can't go more than a couple minutes without breathing. Heart rate, obviously, your heart pumping. Right? These are the things you have to survive. Reticular formation, like I mentioned earlier, that would be the next box up. Helps regulate attention and alertness. So like I said earlier, this is a network of neurons in the brainstem and the thalamus. So key thing, what does the reticular formation do? They deal with sleep and arousal and attention. So they filter incoming stimuli to discriminate irrelevant background stimuli. So it helps you pay attention in class, maybe helps you pay attention to these notes right now. Helps you from falling asleep in class. Make sure you're awake during a test. And more importantly, it helps you, distinguish, irrelevant background information. So if you're sitting in a classroom or if you're sitting, at home listening to this right now, and maybe, there's a TV going on, you got siblings, being loud, it helps you block that out and focus just on these notes right here. So if you think about like some people with like ADD, ADHD, they have trouble doing that. They have trouble discriminating that background filter and often get distracted by that. So the pons, this would actually be the fourth one up here, helps coordinate movements on the left and right sides of the body. All right, so an example of this could be postural reflexes, which help you maintain balance while standing or moving. So key thing here, helps coordinates movements, left and right sides of the body, so pretty much it helps you balance. And as we move on, you're going to see the cerebellum kind of does this as well. You're going to see some parts of the brain, has the same function in different parts. Where the pons is, when we talk about the brain evolution, it's the beginning of the brain. Well, as the brain evolved, other parts of the brain started doing the same things, but they would do it like a little bit better, a little bit higher order. And you'll see that next with the cerebellum, how it kind of does the same thing, but it does even more. And so we talked about the cerebellum. That's that third box there, coordinates movements, balance, and posture. So it literally means little brain. We call it the second brain because it literally looks like a miniature brain at the back of your head. So it's coordinated rapid voluntary movements. So like playing the piano, kicking, throwing, so all that muscle memory we talked about. This is where you put your procedural memories are kept. How to ride a bike, how to swim. I'm sure you've heard, once you learn to ride a bike, you can always remember to ride a bike because that's that muscle memory. You don't have to think about it; it just kind of happens. All right, so we're dealing with coordination like we were at the pons, but it's that next level up. Right? It's not just movement and balancing. It's playing basketball, roller skating, whatever it might be. It's that muscle memory. You can do it without even thinking. So we talked about typing earlier without even looking. That would be the cerebellum, right? Same thing with like playing a piano, knowing all the keys on piano or on a keyboard, being able to type it out, right? You could do it without even thinking about it. That's that muscle memory that we're talking about. So something we're going to be doing this unit is look at to fully understand the brain. You would have to understand, well, what would happen if there was damage to that part of the brain? And so we're going to be doing that as well. One of the things I usually have students do, and we'll talk about this, is you always need to have an example of how you would use the brain. So as you're going through these notes, one of the things I like to do is have students, write down how would you use this part of the brain to drive a car, right? So so you always need to apply it to something. Well, if you had damage to your cerebellum, you wouldn't be able to do certain things. So if you had damage or lesions to your cerebellum, some of the ways you'd be affected is you might have jerky or exaggerated movements. You might have difficulty walking. You might have a loss of balance. You might have shaky hands, right? Because those all deal with rapid voluntary movements.